A sound woke Josiah Kettleman past midnight, not the wind, not a coyote, but the particular creak of the hayloft ladder taking weight it wasn't built to hold. He came off his cot with the rifle already in his hands, boots forgotten, and crossed the yard barefoot through frost-stiff grass toward the barn, where a thin gold line of lantern light leaked between the boards. He eased the door open, expecting a horse thief. Instead, he found a woman pressed against the loft rail with a baby-faced girl of 5 asleep against her shoulder, and around her in the hay, curled together for warmth like a litter of pups, 4 more children, the oldest a boy near 12 with his arm thrown protective over a girl of 10. The middle 2, twins by the look of them, tangled in a single shawl. "Please," the woman said, before he could speak, before he could even lower the rifle. Her voice did not break, though it clearly wanted to. "Please, mister. One night. We'll be gone by first light, I swear it on my husband's grave. They haven't eaten since yesterday noon, and I couldn't have them sleep on open ground with the temperature dropping the way it is." Josiah Kettleman had buried his own wife 8 winters back, and the daughter who never drew breath beside her, and in all that time he had let exactly no one past his gate who didn't have ranch business. He looked at the children in the hay, at the way the oldest boy had positioned himself between the strangers and his sisters even half asleep, and felt something in his chest crack loose that he'd have sworn was set in stone. "Barn's warmer than open ground," he said finally, lowering the rifle. "Colder than my kitchen, though." He didn't know why he said the next part. It arrived on its own, the way weather did. "There's a fire banked in the stove. Bring them in before that girl catches a chill." The woman, Mercy Colby, she told him once the children were fed on biscuits and salt pork at his table and asleep again in a nest of quilts by the hearth, did not cry until she thought he'd gone out to check the stock. He heard her anyway, through the door he'd left cracked, and he stood a long moment in the cold dark yard before he made himself walk on, because a woman was entitled to grieve without an audience. Even a stranger's barn was that much mercy. By the time he came back in, she had dried her face and sat straight backed at his table like a woman determined not to be pitied. "We'll go at first light," she said again. "You needn't trouble yourself further." "Where to?" Josiah asked, though it was none of his business, and he knew it. Her jaw worked before she answered. "I don't rightly know yet." That was answer enough. He set another log on the fire and did not press her further, but he did not sleep that night either, turning over in his mind an arithmetic that made no sense. 6 more mouths on a ranch he could barely keep solvent, a note coming due to Whitfield at the bank come spring, and Silas Pruitt next door circling his water rights like a buzzard waiting on a lamed horse to finally lie down. He rose before dawn anyway, as he always did, and found himself standing longer than he meant to in the doorway of the front room, looking at the 5 sleeping shapes tangled in quilts before his cold hearth. The girl of 10 had drawn the youngest, Ruth. He'd learn her name was tight against her side in her sleep, the way an older sister does without being asked, and the boy Eli had positioned himself nearest the door, still guarding even unconscious. Josiah had forgotten, in 8 years of solitary mornings, what a house sounded like with breathing in it besides his own. He found he did not hate the sound. That surprised him more than anything else that strange night had brought. Mercy woke at dawn from long habit, expecting to gather her children and walk on, though walking on toward what she still could not say. Her husband Thomas had been dead 5 months, thrown from a spooked horse on a road he'd traveled 1,000 times. And in the settling of his debts his brother Tobias had come sniffing after the only thing of value the family had left, not grief, not the children he claimed to want to provide for, but the 40 acres Thomas had willed to Mercy outright. Land Tobias believed by rights should have passed to him as the elder Colby. When she'd refused to sign it over, Tobias had gone to the circuit judge with talk of an unfit widow, 5 children and no means, and threatened to have them declared wards of the county, parceled out to whatever household would take a strong back cheap, if she didn't surrender the deed first. She'd taken the children and run rather than wait to see if he meant it. She found the rancher. Josiah, one of the hands, had called him the evening before, though the man himself offered little, already up and working before the sun cleared the ridge, mending a section of fence with the single-minded focus of someone who preferred fence rails to conversation. She gathered her children quietly, meaning to slip away without troubling him for a farewell, but Eli, her eldest, had wandered to watch the man work and came back with an odd look on his young face. He asked did I know how to set a post, Illy reported. I said I did some. He said come hold this one steady then. Mercy found Josie measuring the boy with a glance that wasn't kind, only assessing, the way he might size up a horse he was considering. Ranch this size, I could use another pair of hands, even young ones, he said, not quite looking at her. Ground's frozen too hard for you to be walking children through it with no place fixed to land. That's not charity. That's arithmetic. Boy earns his keep, I feed him proper. Same goes for the rest, once they're of an age. And me? Mercy asked, 'cause pride made her ask it plainly rather than let it sit unspoken between them. Ranch hasn't had a woman's hand in the kitchen in 8 years, Josiah said. Meals I cook a man wouldn't wish on his enemy. A corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, more the ghost of one long unused. Call it a trade. Roof and board for cooking and mending. Nothing more asked, nothing more offered. She should have said no. She had learned, in 5 months of widowhood, exactly how far a woman's trust could be abused by men who dressed obligation up as kindness. But the twins were shivering despite the sun, and Ruth had not stopped coughing since the second night on the road, and pride was a poor blanket against a cross-timbers winter. 2 weeks, Mercy said, until I've a plan of my own. 2 weeks became a month before either of them spoke of it again. The days settled into a rhythm neither of them named aloud for fear of frightening it off. Mercy rose before light to bake and found the pantry, bare when she'd first opened it, stocked with little beyond flour and salt pork. Slowly filling with things Josiah brought back from town without comment, dried apples, a sack of coffee, a bolt of warm flannel he left folded on the table and pretended not to notice her thanking him for. Hannah, the 10-year-old, took to trailing after him in the evenings while he mended tack, asking questions about every tool on his wall until he found himself explaining leatherwork to a child with more patience than he'd ever shown a grown hand. Even Ruth, shyest of the 5, warmed enough by the second week to bring him wildflowers gone half to weed, which he kept in a tin cup on the windowsill until they dried to nothing, unwilling to throw them out. It was Eli, though, who tested him hardest and won him fastest. The boy worked like a man trying to prove something, up before the sun and last to quit at dusk, and Josiah recognized in that fierce, silent labor the particular grief of a boy who had lost his father too young and meant to fill the space himself if no one else would show him how. So Josiah showed him how to read weather in a cloud bank, how to gentle a green colt instead of breaking it, how a man carried his worry without letting it curdle into anger. Neither of them called it anything like affection. But by the second month, Eli had taken to walking beside him rather than behind, and that Josiah thought was its own kind of word spoken plain. Josiah told himself it was arithmetic, same as he'd said. A woman who could cook, mend, keep a garden, and manage a house was worth her keep twice over on a ranch running lean. Even the small ones found chores enough to earn their supper, gathering eggs, carrying water, the twins trailing after Amos, his one hired hand, like a pair of determined shadows learning to coil rope. It was arithmetic, he told himself, watching Mercy Colby hang wash in the yard with sunlight catching the loose strands of her hair. And it was arithmetic that made his chest go tight when little Ruth's cold worsened instead of clearing, and Mercy sat up 3 nights running with the child fever bright against her shoulder. On the 4th night he found Mercy asleep, sitting upright in the rocking chair by the hearth. Ruth finally cool and quiet against her, and he stood in the doorway a long while before he crossed the room, lifted the sleeping child with more care than he knew he still possessed, and carried her to the trundle bed the older children shared, tucking the quilt beneath her chin the way he dimly remembered his own mother doing for him. When he turned, Mercy was awake and watching him, and neither of them said anything about what they'd seen in the other's face, because there are things a person isn't ready to name even when they're standing plain in a firelit room. The town of Cross Timbers, when Mercy rode in with him the following Sunday to sell eggs and get supplies, was less generous with its silence. She felt the stairs before she heard the whispers. A widow with 5 children living under a bachelor rancher's roof was exactly the kind of arithmetic that added up to scandal in minds inclined toward it, whatever the truth of separate rooms and honest labor. Mrs. Abernathy at the mercantile made a point of asking, loud enough for the whole store to hear, whether Mrs. Colby's situation with Mr. Kettleman had been blessed by a preacher yet, and Mercy felt the old fear rise in her, not fear for herself. She had weathered worse than gossip, but fear that this too would be used against her, more fuel for Tobias's claim that she kept an unfit house. Reverend Cole, at least, spoke to her kindly after service, though even his kindness carried a question underneath it, and it was Josiah, silent through the whole exchange, jaw set hard as the fence posts he drove, who finally said, in a voice that carried, "Mrs. Colby and her children have a roof, because I offered it, and she accepted honest work, same as any hired hand on my place. Any man wants to make more of it than that can say so to my face instead of hers." The store went quiet. Nobody said anything more. Mercy rode home from town that day with her jaw set and her hands tight on the reins, and it was only once the children were out of earshot, playing at the creek with the last of the afternoon light, that she let Josiah see how deep the whispering had cut. "I've been called worse than a fallen woman before," she told him, sitting on the porch step with her arms wrapped around her knees like a girl half her age. "It isn't the words, it's that Tobias will hear them too, and use every one of them like a nail in a coffin lid. He doesn't need truth. He only needs enough doubt to make a judge look twice." Josiah did not offer easy comfort, because he'd learned by then that Mercy Colby had little patience for comfort that wasn't backed by something solid. "Then we give the judge nothing to doubt," he said instead. "You keep your own room same as you always have. The whole town can watch us do right by each other in broad daylight till they're satisfied or till they're tired of looking. Either way, we'll have done nothing but truth." It wasn't romance, what passed between them on that step. But it was a promise, and Mercy found she trusted it more than she'd have trusted any softer word. But word travelled, as word does, and it travelled far enough to reach a man with reason to be listening for it. Tobias Colby arrived on a grey afternoon 2 weeks later with a lawyer from the county seat and a folded paper he held like a weapon, and Mercy's stomach dropped clean through the floor when she saw him swing down from his horse in the yard, because she recognized in the set of his shoulders the particular hunger of a man who believed he had finally cornered what he was owed. "I've come for what's mine," Tobias announced, before greetings, before even acknowledging the children who'd gone still and silent at the sight of him. "The judge has heard testimony that you've taken up housekeeping, unwed, under a stranger's roof, abandoned proper care of 5 children for your own comfort. That's grounds enough. I mean to have them placed with kin, as is only right, and the land reverts to the estate administrator until the matter's settled. That's the law, Mercy, whether you like the shape of it or not. She's under my roof because she works for her keep, same as any hand on this ranch," Josiah said, coming from the barn at a hard walk, and Mercy had never in her life been so grateful to hear a voice. "You want to talk law? We'll talk law in front of the circuit judge, not wave paper at a woman in her own dooryard like it settles anything." "The judge already has the paper," the lawyer said smoothly. "This is a courtesy visit, Mr. Kettleman, nothing more. Mrs. Colby may accompany the children peaceably, or the county sheriff will be along to see it done less peaceably. Either way, the children leave with their uncle today." Eli stepped in front of his younger siblings without being told, chin lifted, 12 years old and trying with everything in him to look like a wall. "We're not going with him," the boy said. "He never once came around when Pa was alive. He only wants the land." "Boy doesn't get a say," Tobias snapped, and something in his tone, the flat, careless cruelty of it, was answer enough to every question Mercy had ever had about what her children's lives would become under his roof. It was Josiah who moved first, stepping between Tobias and the children with the unhurried certainty of a man who had made up his mind and would not be moved from it short of force. "You'll not lay a hand on any child standing in my yard," he said, quiet, which was somehow worse than shouting. "And you'll not take them anywhere today on the strength of a piece of paper and a story about their mother that isn't true. I've stood witness to how she keeps this house and these children every day for a month, and I'll say so to any judge in the territory. You want a fight, Colby, you've got one. But it won't be over before winter, and it won't go the way you think." Tobias's eyes flicked from Josiah to the children to Mercy, doing his own arithmetic, and whatever sum he arrived at, he did not like it well enough to press further that afternoon. "This isn't finished," he said, swinging back up onto his horse. "I'll see you all in front of the judge before the month's out." He rode off with his lawyer trailing, and the yard stayed silent a long moment after the sound of hooves had faded. 5 children pressed close around their mother, and Mercy found she was shaking only once the danger had passed. That night, after the children were finally asleep, she found Josiah sitting alone on the porch step, staring out at nothing. "You didn't have to do that," she said, settling beside him though he hadn't invited it. "Stand up for us the way you did. It isn't your fight." "Made it mine the night I found you in my hayloft," Josiah said, same as the arithmetic did. He was quiet a moment, turning his hat in his hands. "I had a wife once, Naomi. 8 years gone this winter, her and the baby both, and I told myself after that I'd shut the gate on anyone getting close enough to hurt me that way again. Been keeping that gate shut a long while." He looked at her then, and there was nothing gruff left in his face at all. "Don't rightly know how to keep it shut anymore, Mercy. Don't know that I want to." She did not answer with words. She reached over and took his hand where it rested on his knee, and he did not pull away, and for a long while that was the whole of what needed saying between them. The judge's hearing was set for the 2nd week of December, but trouble did not wait politely for court dates. Silas Pruitt, who had spent 2 years trying to force Josiah to sell his water rights by underbidding him at every turn and spreading word through the bank that the Kettleman's spread was overextended, saw in Tobias Colby's visit an opportunity too fine to pass up. If Josiah were tangled in a custody fight, distracted, his reputation whispered about in town, he'd be that much easier to press when the note came due at Whitfield's bank, and if the widow and her brood were removed from the equation entirely, so much the better for a neighbor eager to see the Kettleman ranch fail and fall into his own hands for pennies. Pruitt found Tobias in town nursing a grudge and a whiskey, and by the time the 2 men parted ways, Tobias had a new idea in his head about how to settle matters faster than any judge could arrange, and Pruitt had exactly the kind of night in mind that would serve 2 purposes with one match. The storm rolled in 3 nights before the hearing, black clouds stacking over the ridge until the wind screamed loud enough to rattle the shutters. And Josiah was out past midnight in the sleeting rain checking that the cattle hadn't drifted into the arroyo when he smelled smoke on air that had no business carrying it. He ran. Later he would not remember covering the distance between the north pasture and the barn, only that his lungs burned with cold and effort and terror in equal measure by the time he broke into the yard and saw flame already climbing the barn's near wall, hungry orange light thrown wild against the storm-black sky, and the hayloft, where Ely and his younger brother Daniel had begged that very evening to sleep out near the new calves born too early for the cold, was already swallowed in smoke. "Mercy," he bellowed, and she was already there, already running from the house in her nightdress with no thought for the cold, because a mother hears her children's danger before anyone has to tell her of it. "They're in the loft," she screamed, and would have run straight into the burning barn herself if Josiah hadn't caught her arm. "I'll get them. Get Ruth and Hannah clear of the yard, keep them back." He did not wait for her answer. He went through the barn door into smoke thick enough to blind, calling the boys' names, feeling his way along the stalls by memory alone while burning hay rained sparks from above and the roof beams groaned with a sound like something dying. He found them huddled at the loft's edge, Daniel crying, Ely with his little brother's coat wrapped around both their faces against the smoke, trying with everything his 12 years could manage to find a way down through fire that had already taken the ladder. "Jump," Josiah shouted up at them, arms already raised. "I'll catch you, both of you, I swear it. Jump now. There's no time left to think on it." Daniel went first, screaming the whole way down into Josiah's arms, and Josiah staggered but held, setting the boy on his feet and shoving him toward the door. Ely hesitated one terrible second too long, looking back at something, the 2 orphaned calves penned below, too small and new to save themselves, and Josiah understood in that instant exactly whose son the boy was raised to be, decent to the bone even with the roof about to fall in on him. "Now, Eli, the calves aren't worth your life and your mother's heart besides. G.U.M.P." The boy jumped. Josiah caught him, staggering under the weight, and turned for the door just as a beam let go above them with a sound like a rifle crack. And something struck him hard across the shoulders and drove him to his knees in the burning straw. Ely still gripped safe against his chest, shielded by his own body from the falling wood. Pain went through him bright and total, and for one long moment the world narrowed down to smoke and heat and the boy's frightened breathing under his arm, and Josiah thought, with a strange and total calm, that he might not up again. He got up again. He did not know afterward where the strength came from, only that it was there when he needed it, and he carried Ely out through the door and into the rain-lashed yard, and did not let go of the boy until Mercy had both her sons in her arms, sobbing into their smoke-blackened hair, before Josiah's knees finally buckled and the dark closed over him entirely. The last thing he heard, before the world black and silent, was Mercy's voice above him, ragged with terror and something fiercer than terror, calling his name over and over as though the sound of it alone could keep him tethered to the earth. He held on to that voice through whatever came after, through Amos hauling him clear of the wreckage, through the jolting ride to the house, through fever dreams thick with smoke and Naomi's face, and strangest of all, Mercy's hands cool against his brow, reel away the dreams were not. Mercy nursed him through 3 days of fever from the burn across his back, and the smoke that had scarred his lungs raw, and she did not leave his bedside except to tend her children and the ranch both. Because a ranch did not stop needing hands, simply because its owner lay half-conscious and murmuring her name in his sleep. Amos rode for the doctor and rode again for the sheriff, 'cause in the wreck of the burned barn they found, unmistakable, the broken remains of a kerosene lantern that had had no earthly business being stored anywhere near the hayloft, set deliberately and set by someone who knew exactly which corner of the barn the children slept in that night. It did not take the sheriff long to find the truth of it. A ranch hand of Pruitt's, conscience finally overmatching loyalty, came forward with what he'd seen, Pruitt and Tobias together in the rain that night, and Tobias's boot prints matched clean to marks found beneath the loft window. Whatever Tobias had told himself about custody and county law and a nephew's rightful land, he had crossed, that night, into something the territory did not forgive, and when the sheriff came to take him he did not resist, only stared at Mercy across the yard with an expression that held, for the first time, something like the shame that should have stopped him from the start. Silas Pruitt fared no better. Whitfield at the bank, hearing the whole account, found himself considerably less inclined to call in notes on a rancher half the county was now calling a hero, and considerably more inclined to look hard at Pruitt's own overextended debts that came due faster than the man could manage once his reputation collapsed along with his scheme. By the time the snow set in for good, Pruitt had sold out and moved on, and nobody in Cross Timbers troubled themselves over much about where. Josiah woke fully on the 4th morning to find Mercy asleep in the chair beside his bed, exactly as he'd once found her asleep with Ruth in the rocking chair by the hearth, and something in the sight of her, worn thin with worry over him now instead of her children, chosen to stay instead of forced to run, settled a question in his chest that had been circling there for weeks. "You stayed," he said, and his voice came out rough as gravel from the smoke still healing in his throat. Mercy's eyes opened, and whatever she saw in his face brought her out of the chair and to the edge of the bed without hesitation. "Where else would I be," she said, "but exactly where I am." The judge's hearing never happened. There was no case left to hear, with Tobias in the county jail and no claim left standing against a woman the whole territory now knew had raised 5 children through hardship, hunger, and fire without once losing her nerve or her tenderness. But Josiah rode to the county seat anyway, once his shoulder had healed enough to bear a saddle, and came back with a different kind of paper altogether, one that made no claim on land or custody, only on a future he intended to build in full daylight, with nothing left to whisper about. He asked her on the porch step where they'd first held hands in the dark, with all 5 children crowded in the doorway pretending not to watch, Ely grinning outright, Ruth clapping her small hands together at the sight of the ring, though she couldn't have said what it meant. "I've got a ranch that needs a woman's hand in the kitchen," Josiah said, "and a heart that's needed one a good deal longer than I let myself admit. Marry me, Mercy. Let me finish what I started the night I found you in my hayloft. Let me be a father to your children and a husband to you, not out of arithmetic anymore, but because I love you plain and simple, same as any man ever loved a woman." "Yes," Mercy said, before he'd properly finished asking, the way she'd once told him she would go by first light and instead had stayed a lifetime. "Yes, Josiah, 1,000 times yes." They were married before Christmas in the little church at Cross Timbers, with Reverend beaming through the whole ceremony and Mrs. Abernathy, of all people, crying openly in the second pew. The new barn went up that spring with the whole town lending hands, raised on the ashes of the old one. And by the time the first snow of the following winter dusted the roof of the house, where 6 people now slept warm and fed and wanted, nobody in Cross Timbers called Josiah Kettleman the gruff loner of the ranch out past the ridge anymore. They called him, when they spoke of him at all, a lucky man, and he never once disagreed, watching Mercy move through the lamplit kitchen with Ruth on her hip, and Eli home from evening chores, and the twins fighting over the last biscuit at the table, the whole loud, warm, impossible weight of a family he had once told himself he'd never risk loving again. By dawn on that first morning after the fire, watching them all sleep safe under his roof, he had called them his own in his heart, long before the law or the church ever made it so, and some promises he had learned were kept from the very first moment a person meant them.